Good morning. Hope everyone had a good weekend. And if you're watching this, I hope that the rest of your week goes well. And I hope that all of us can kind of thaw out after the last couple of weeks. It looks to be a promising start to the week, anyway. If you take a quick look, remember your paper's due Wednesday. Remember, we're doing Macbeth all the way through the 5th. Remember, those of you who are assigned to do the presentation, that is due on the 5th. And remember, we will have a quiz over Macbeth on the 5th. I am not very artistic. And so anytime I can find a program that lets me draw a circle or an oval and type inside, I'm very proud of myself. And in this case, I made a visual. And one of the things that interests me the most about the play Macbeth is the witches, or are the witches. The one thing that interests me is the witches. All right. And the witches interest me for a couple of reasons. Number one, and we'll get to this later, do they cause Macbeth to take the road he takes? Are they just a figment of his imagination in the sense that Banquo doesn't seem to act on the witches the way Macbeth does? Are they something that prompted him to do what he already wanted to do? What exactly are they? And there are people who argue that the witches are the heroes of the play because they disrupt this very, very corrupt moral order. But I think physically, at the very, very beginning, they are also interesting. You have a male actor portraying a witch who is supposed to look like a woman, but whose beards forbade Macbeth from seeing them as women. There's a lot to unpack here. And I think I want to spend some time looking at those little zones where everything is supposed to intersect. For example, we know that male actors portrayed women in all of Shakespeare's plays. We know that women, or characters who were women, sometimes impersonated men, and that to make a point. And so, you've got a fluid gender thing that runs through some of Shakespeare's plays, but this strikes me as unique to Shakespeare's plays. And I want to look, I think, at those little zones where everything overlaps. I also made another visual. It strikes me that the witches operate in a very, very narrow zone, and that narrow zone is important to understanding Shakespeare's use of the witches in this play. On the left, you see there's a spiritual zone, God or the gods, witches, magic, spirits, magical events, miracles. Magic must have been very important. I've stuck it in there twice. On the other side, you have Madonna and her material world. And you have Aristotle, and you have the material world. And you have things like string theory to explain other dimensions, not magic and spirits. You have the Big Bang to explain creation, not necessarily God. Instead of having God or miracles explain things we don't understand in space, we talk about dark matter. But someplace, there's a thin overlap. And I don't know what to call that, whether it's rational mysticism or what. I don't have a term for it, but it strikes me there's an overlap. And look, this is not Collis's own creation. You'll see later in the presentation that I am practicing philosophy without a license, and I am oversimplifying a philosopher named Charles Taylor. But putting witches in the zone that was on the previous slide strikes me as pretty easy. They look like inhabitants of the earth and yet are on it. Or excuse me, they look not like inhabitants of the earth, yet they are on it. In other words, they don't look natural. They don't look as if they belong here, but here they are. And then, in the name of truth, are ye fantastical? Truth and fantasy should be two different things. Or that indeed which outwardly you show. You show something, but that's not something that's supposed to actually exist. Banquo and Macbeth seem to be confronting something that comes across from a world that they accept exists but shouldn't be here on Earth. The Earth hath bubbles as water has, and these are one of them. In other words, we're in this little zone, and magic and witches came across the bubble, came across this little zone into our world, and they accepted it as such. When we get to the philosophy without a license, I think you'll see that a lot of people in the year of our Lord 2021 would absolutely refuse to accept that witches crossed through the bubble. They would refuse to accept, in fact, that those bubbles exist. They would explain it as indigestion or hallucinations or something else. But in Shakespeare's time, the bubbles were there, and the inhabitants that looked not like the inhabitants of this world could cross through the bubble to our world. They could come through the rational mystical zone. Suppose I could have just used the Twilight Zone, but I don't have the Rod Serling music. There's also, I think, a connection with the witches that's important to Macbeth. Notice at the very, very beginning, fair is foul and foul is fair. Now, it could be a lot of nonsense. It could be chanting to get the audience in their seats. There could be a lot of things going on here. But we've already questioned whether they're real. And now we have this connection to, so foul and fair a day I have not seen. And so all of a sudden we're starting to question whether, are the witches real, or do they illustrate Macbeth's psychological condition? Do they control Macbeth's fate, as they're linked with the language of fair and foul and fair? Or are they just a physical symbol of Macbeth's ambition, which again is his fatal flaw, which pushes him over the edge and leads to all of the events in the play? I think your textbook mentions that King James wrote a paper on demonology and witches, so he would be interested in all of this. And Shakespeare's getting paid by the king to write these plays, so he's going to play to his audience. At the same time, the audience that's not the king is going to believe that witches are real, while a 21st century audience is not necessarily going to believe that witches in this sense are real. All right? But they may well believe that the witches just illustrate that Macbeth was on the road to doing this, and the witches are just a device for Shakespeare to play that up. However, there are some people who kind of have this idea that witches are real. In fact, this comes from, if you look, an Atlantic article from last year, about a year ago. Working definition of witch used to be someone that causes harm to others by mystical means. Modern witches say that a witch is an embodiment of her truth and all its power. And a witch might embody a religious affiliation, a political act. So we have the same sort of thing that Banquo and Macbeth came upon. Are we dealing with something spiritual, or are we dealing with something of this world? A religious affiliation should be something that points people to the spiritual dimension. A political act is something that's all about the here and now. All right? And so when we look at these two things, you'll notice that this witch, Pam Grossman, says that if I'm doing magic when I march in the streets for causes I believe in, there's a link between magic and a political act. There's a link between the realm that witches and magic inhabit and the political realm marching for causes we believe in. Witches still have the same dichotomy in 2021 that they had for Banquo and for Macbeth. All right. And then if you take a look, one of the stats I wanted to point out was there are 730,000 adult pagans and Wiccans, which is the same as the number of Unitarians. And Wicca is just one of many approaches to witchery. And not all witches consider themselves pagan or Wiccan. Everybody might call themselves a witch. Notice it's sort of mundane as opposed to what Shakespeare's audience would have believed. Because remember, Shakespeare's audience would have believed that witches were real. They would have been frightened by the witches showing up. And also, I want to talk about the number 730,000. Remember, the state of South Dakota only has about 800,000 residents. So there are almost as many pagans and Wiccans in the United States as there are South Dakotans. And then the author of this article gets us between the magic and the mundane with kind of an interesting thing. He went to the witch. The witch was going to make him this candle. And there's a 13-page candle magic workbook. And the reason he wanted the magic was to get some money. And he emailed people who owed him money. He emailed people about the loan. 2 weeks later, if you look at the right hand, Diaz emailed me out of the blue. Your candle, by the way, is done. It burned really well. I was surprised to hear from her and by her timing. 20 minutes before, I found 2 undeposited checks misfiled among the papers on my desk, each worth more than the money I was still owed. It was a coincidence, I'm almost sure, but I felt at that moment like a disorganized but magical being. In other words, the thing with witchcraft put him away from the purely physical zone into a bit of a magical zone that might overlap. But he had not lost completely the idea of he was a disorganized being, he was a mortal being. Witches seem to be, whether it's in Macbeth or whether it's in the year of our Lord 2020 or 2021, to be capable of being in this weird zone. And it's that zone I want to talk about a little bit more. And here's where I commit philosophy without a license. Everyone can agree that one of the big differences between us and our ancestors of 500 years ago, and Shakespeare was a little bit after that, but close enough, is that they lived in an enchanted world, and we do not. At the very least, we live in a much less enchanted world. Even the witches are working for politics. And whatever politics may be, enchanted is not a word that usually goes with it. We may think of this as our having lost a number of beliefs and the practices which made them possible, but more, the enchanted world was one in which these forces could cross a porous boundary and shape our lives, psychic and physical. There are bubbles, and people can, and that's where the witches crossed through and got from their realm to the realm where Macbeth was. And it also might be that you could have a weird situation where the actors were part of a bubble that the audience was viewing things through. I don't want to go that far. One of the big differences between us and them is that we live in a much firmer sense of the boundary between self and other. We are buffered. We have changed. So there's a porous self and there's a buffered self. Alan Jacobs, who's a professor at Baylor, kind of sums it up. The porous self is open to a wide range of forces, from the divine to the demonic, from God to witches. The buffered self is protected from those forces, understands them as definitely outside of it. So in other words, we're not going to look at a witch as something that should be a woman, but whose beard forbids me to interpret that it is so. We're going to look at a witch perhaps as somebody who lights a candle and does some magic, or we're going to look at it as a witch as a charlatan, but they're going to inhabit this physical world. We have a buffer between us and the enchanted world. Jacobs goes on to talk about the porous self, and he says that the porous self is rich, multidimensional, full of life, saturated in meaning, but it's dangerous. So you have a trade-off. You've got a full life, but it's a little frightening because there can be a contest between powerful forces that can destroy you. All right? And in this case, Macbeth is coming into contact with those powerful forces that can destroy him. He is seeing what the poorest self could do. The buffered self has bulwarks against all of that. It demotes the magic to delusions. And remember, nobody but Macbeth or Banquo saw the witches. So you have protection, but an empty life. Jacob says the question, is that all there is, comes from that source. Now look, in the year of our Lord 2021, we have religious people. We have people who believe in God, and we have people who believe in the devil, and we have people who believe in demons, and who probably, a few of them, might want to start burning witches, or in the United States, hanging them because we didn't burn any. But a guy named Dale Coulter, writing about Charles Taylor and Charles Taylor's work, says that even those who operate with a porous self, or who seem to operate with a porous self, there's a social context that it might just be a mental state. And so I think as we're thinking about that, it's important to understand. Now, perhaps no one watching this is a Pentecostal. Coulter goes on to talk about that Pentecostals live, move, and have their being in an area of religious populism. So do Catholics, Orthodox, and all Protestants, because of this belief that there is a higher power, because there is a God. But even so, there is always this pushback. And so I think looking at Macbeth and trying to figure out what to do with the witches, we have to figure out whether we believe that this little zone is big enough so that they are actually crossing over, and that Shakespeare's audience believed that they were actually crossing over, or whether we're going to be a full 21st century human and buffer and say, no, that's not what happened. It was just Macbeth's subconscious pushing him anyway, and the witches were just a plot device to make King James happy and to frighten people. And to go back to the frightening thing, let's go one step further. One of the things that I think is interesting is, do we try to contain or create a porous self in the year of our Lord 2021? Taylor wrote this a few years back, but I'm going to read this one. The clearest sign of the transformation in our world is that today many people look back to the world of the porous self with nostalgia, as though the creation of a thick emotional boundary between us and the cosmos were now lived as a loss. The aim is to try to recover some measure of this lost feeling. So people go to movies about the uncanny in order to experience a frisson. Our peasant ancestors would have thought us insane. You can't get a frisson from what is really, in fact, terrifying you. All right? So I think it's important to take a look at this idea of what can we recreate that porous self? That porous self that existed back then, we probably can't recreate by trying to scare ourselves with a film. More importantly, though, I think, is something Ellen Jacobs get to. Individuals and cultures oscillate between the porous and the buffered condition. As terror grows, we seek protection. As emptiness grows, we seek fullness. Jacobs writes that he is interested in the ways that people seek and escape from this oscillation. Some structure of experience that claims to provide fullness without terror, protection without emptiness. And I think that's what Shakespeare's audience was trying to do as well. I think that is part of the human experience. How do we get fullness without terror, protection without emptiness, And do the witches and Macbeth illustrate a way that that doesn't happen? And is there a way to think about how it might happen? I'm just going to let that hang there today. I don't believe that I'll have time to get a daily writing done in class, so we just won't do another daily writing today. I hope to see everyone on Wednesday, and hope everybody has a good day.